because he studies UFOs on a regular basis, and he's worked with the government and so forth. I wish I could mention his name, but again, I don't mention any names unless they give me permission a lot of times, except for the seldom few that are good friends of mine. And he said, think of it this way. They're not saying neener, 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 but perhaps, maybe just perhaps, some of those claims, some of those markers and so forth are the same way that we mark our own animals when we study them as zoologists. They're not flying in our skies going neener, 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 but they're curious because we are cavemen. So they're tagging us, they're watching us, and they're treating us just like a zoo.
Well, look at all the people, though, who have gone missing in the National Forest. Not just the National Forest. The people have gone missing off the face of Earth without no trace. You know, we have... If you start doing research, you even got cities and towns sometimes that have totally disappeared. Although they're very rural, if you look deep enough, you're going, why would a whole group of people just disappear? Yeah. Well, what do you think about that, Michael?
Well, I think you're both right on that. I mean, you're not only villages. I've heard of the famous village up there in Alaska that the natives, for some reason, just disappeared up there all at once, and no one knows what happened to them. But there's, of course, historically, whole races of people that just either picked up and moved immediately, the Anunnaki, or they, for some reason, just died out very, very fast because those archaeological sites that have, really perplexed some of the scientists are fascinating to study as well.
Well, and then you have the history involved in some of the bigger names that are a part of history and archaeology that make you wonder, that are linked to unusual and magnificent stories. And they could all be stories, but when you're going through the history and you're starting to research things, and I was fascinated with this, by the way, to the point to where some people will go, really, because you don't do enough research. I found one name that was very, very unique, believe it or not, that's a part of mythology, but there are resemblances, even if you go into history, that somehow in some shape or form that these particular people existed and they traveled. And one of them is Merlin, though he is named different. Most people aren't aware that Merlin touches base on many, many cultures. He was in Japan, he was in England, and several other countries under the same name.
Oh.
And he very specifically talks in these cultures about having advanced knowledge, living with a culture at one point that was advanced. And this is all things you've probably even heard of it on the History Channel if you look somewhere along the line, because I'm not the only one that's read into this. But it's fascinating. When you start getting into these different cultures and you look at the links of the possibility of aliens, it's really fascinating. I mean, you see it on hieroglyphs. You see things that you just simply can't explain that would indicate that, we very well could have been visited somewhere along the line by something that was a heck of a lot more advanced than us.
Or maybe our civilization has been rebooted, the same way. You go cut a forest down and plant new trees. What's been really interesting is that it came out a couple months ago, the wear marks on the back of the Sphinx puts it back before man. And what scientists are now starting to say that wear marks on the back of it was created by an ocean. And then they started figuring out when the ocean was there the last time, and that puts it before, me and you, or our distant cousins, and any relatives were walking the earth. Now, how did that thing get created and put there? I know that the face has been altered to what it is now from the original, but again, the wear marks on the back of it, they said it wasn't from sand blowing, it was from wear of an ocean or of water rushing on it. And wearing it.
One has to ask where all the myths come from originally. I mean, were we the only culture that was here? Maybe there was something before us, and maybe they were what was before us.
Well, I think we've probably been rebooted several times. Just like we destroyed ourselves. Something happened, and then we started up again, or maybe help with maybe aliens even. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows the answer. Like my mom always, when I was a kid, I always asked my mom, where did God come from? And my mom would say, Stop asking that question. You'll go mad. You'll go crazy. Nobody knows. That's an answer that nobody can give you, or a question that nobody could ever give you an answer to. Well, the same way, I really got a funny feeling that we're not the first generation of humans on this earth.
We may not even be the original creations that were on the earth. Maybe these things were here before us, and they colonized in other places, and that's why they keep coming back and observing, because this used to be their homeworld.
Oh, yeah. And maybe they're keeping an eye on us. Again, I don't know. I can honestly tell you this. If an alien spaceship landed, and I still think the same way that Orson Welles, and I've said this to you, Michael, before on the broadcast, how people who didn't tune into that CBS radio play, The War of the Worlds, freaked out because a lot of them, thought we're being invaded. Well, I think even now, I don't know if a UFO landed and some guys in a silver or gold suit or nude even came out of the spaceship, and I don't think the human population could handle it. Because we've been...
I think there's always going to be that version of people that are going to think we're being invaded. They're going to want to start a resistance. They're not going to accept it. You could have something fly down tomorrow and say, I'm going to give you all the answers you ever need. I'm going to cure cancer. And some group somewhere is going to go against that, thinking they're trying to take over the world.
Well, I don't know, but I keep remembering that old Twilight Zone episode where these aliens came down, right, and gave the scientists this big, thick book, right? And they did break down the wording of the book. That was the hard part. It said, to serve man. So they assumed that these nice aliens were, coming down and giving us technology, and all of a sudden the airports all were no airplanes anymore. It was UFOs taking people to their planet, to give them a good life, right? And then I remember this one head scientist, he got chosen to go on that flight to go to their planet. And just as he was halfway up the gangplank, right, one of the lady scientists come running, and she goes, we broke the code of the book. Don't get on the ship. Don't get on the ship. And he goes, why? Why? To serve man is a cookbook. And I just look at it this way. Well, people are naive yet. So, even if a species of aliens came down and said, hey, we want to help mankind and gave us some technology, you always have to look at the other flip side. But why are they doing it?
Well, it's human instinct. And human instinct, there's always going to be a combatants with it. There's always going to be like I said, you could have God, for instance, could come down tomorrow and say, I'm healing everybody. It's going to be a paradise. And somebody's going to think God is evil.
Well, I'm going to say something else, and I got a whole bunch of flack. I didn't even tell you about that, Michael. When I was talking about God the other night, I kind of maybe overstepped it, okay? But I was talking about, well, if there's a God, then what created God? Then what created that God? So, and mankind always had to believe in the fire God, the water God, you name it, some type of God of Olympus, the gods, right? They need that, because without having some belief in something, man wouldn't exist. That faith has kept man going through some of the worst things it could ever happen to, mankind. And if you took that away from...
Faith is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Faith is a wonderful thing. I never downtread religions because of that. And I believe there's a difference between religion and God because of my own personal beliefs. But I think faith is a wonderful thing. It brings people together. It brings nations together. It tears nations apart, too, because of the natural humanity and combatants. But I think it's a wonderful thing. You reminded me of something that I'm going to bring up that's off the subject, but not. We were talking about Bigfoot earlier, and I had the wonderful privilege of talking to a historian that's an archaeologist, and he has a friend that's a zoologist, and he said, if you look into some of the more modern breakdowns today and you start breaking into the history, could Bigfoot have existed in these early cultures, and could it possibly be running around today? The answer is yes, because if you actually look at what was discovered as opposed to our evolutionary ladder, you find out that at one point in history, there were not one form of an ape man, but there were multiple forms of ape men that were running around. And he said, there's proof of this. It doesn't release, but there's actual physical proof of this. You'll find different skulls, different races, and different cultures that lived around the same period in time before we had the Ice Ages, before we had everything else. So what's to say that some of those didn't exist beyond that and lived with the American Indians and so forth? That's a logical explanation.
Well, I will say this too. Some of my family members, for my daughter, she married into a local Indian tribe, and my grandkids are from two fathers, two different Indian tribes, and I got to know, like, on one tribe, back a few years ago, the medicine woman. They didn't have a medicine man at that time. They had a medicine woman, and we were talking about Bigfoot and all that stuff. And she started telling me, stories about Bigfoot, that it was handed down from the medicine man to her, from that medicine man to him, and basically what she told me is, and I only go by what she told me, but I also heard this thing from the other tribe too, about Bigfoot. And they said pretty much the same thing, that Bigfoot have never really been friendly towards man, that, they would come in and pillage their village, take, the squaws and children, and basically they were cannibals, and that's their generation to generation back. There's stories about it. I don't know if you heard about that, Michael, but that's where I kind of get in my mind when these people say that Bigfoot are so loving and so caring, that I just can't believe it. I disagree. If something lives out in the forest, out in the woods, away from mankind, they're not even going to think the same way that me and you think. They're going to look at us as a threat. They're going to look at us. They don't know what a human is. They're going to just look at us as something that they don't want.
Animal instinct. It would be almost like running across a bobcat or a tiger or
sure.
so forth.
Yep.
You're treading on their territory. So get too close and you're going to get bit.
Yeah. In the case though, like she was telling me about, the women would be out on the river, doing their laundry with their little, kids. Bigfoots would come in, attack, take off a couple of the squaws, take some of the children, and then, a few days later, they're out there looking to get their wives back, right? And get their kids back, and then they find bones and clothing pieces, that's where the cannibalism part came in. Because again, we look at like what we eat, we don't know what they eat. So we have our morals, right? It tells us it's not right to eat another human being, unless you're out in the, around the equator and a few places like that. You wouldn't think about that. But again, with maybe a different type of creature, the way it was brought up and how it had to defend itself out there, they would look at us maybe like, when they catch a deer.
Well, theoretically, space would be the same way when you're talking about alien races. Now, being a fan of Star Trek, I'd like to think it all works like the Prime Directive and everything else. I'd like to think that they're just waiting for us to be intelligent enough to come down and say, congratulations, you can travel past your stars now. Let's teach you a thing or two. But reality is, when we're treading out in space, and whether we're a caveman, whether we're unique, whether we're whatever we are, if we're treading out into space into a culture where they've already advanced and they already own it, we could be a threat.
Oh, yeah, we could. Like Stephen Hawking said, even before his death, he kept trying to tell the world leaders, stop sending our address out in space. Stop sending out where we're located. You might not like the response you get one day. And,
theoretically, we are an aggressive race. I mean, we fight amongst ourselves for how many centuries now? And we can't come to peace. So if I'm observing that and I'm a different society, I may not like what I see.
Well, unless they're getting, old radio waves, which does take a long time to get out there, old TV shows, unless they're watching Leave It to Beaver, if they're watching like the Cowboy and Indians and the war movies and cop and robber type movies and all these other series of shows that's been on TV, they would look at us as barbarians, that shouldn't even be alive.
Yeah. Barbaric, because we're spending more time fighting amongst ourselves than resolving issues that should be resolved. So if you're observing that, then maybe that's all you want to do, and just stay a distance and say, look, I really don't want these people out in my space.
Well, Michael had a cure for it. Wasn't that the Hitchhiker Guide to the